Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. On behalf of the University of California, Riverside Alumni Association, thank you for tuning in today for our virtual homecoming Q&A session with Christy Lopez, focused on social justice. My name is Maddie Bunting, and I am the Dean's Chief Brand Ambassador and Public Affairs Student Assistant at the UCR School of Public Policy. Homecoming is historically a time for Highlanders from all over to come together on campus and community, but this year we are bringing the festivities to you from the safety of your home. We are excited to be hosting a week's worth of events to connect students, alumni, parents, faculty, and staff. By moving all events to virtual, we are able to bring homecoming to Highlanders all over the world. No matter where you are joining us from, we hope you have a happy homecoming week and are glad you chose to join us for what will be an insightful discussion. For your reference, this webinar will be recorded and distributed after it concludes. While we have some prepared questions for our guest speaker, we do want to hear from you. So please submit your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to as many of your questions as we can. But while I give you all a moment to submit your questions, I would love to just start off, Professor Lopez, with a little bit of your background and a question. So you graduated from UCR in 1990 with a BA in history. You then went on to earn your JD at Yale Law School and immediately began your civil rights career. Can you name an event or a moment that led you to specialize in criminal justice and police reform?
Sure, and first let me say thank you so much to you, Maddie, and to UC Riverside for inviting me to have this conversation with all of you today. I'm just tremendously grateful to UC Riverside. I grew up in the area, and being able to go to a great university that was so close to home was nothing short of life-changing for me. So I've always been very appreciative of UC Riverside and the education I got there. So I'm happy to be here to talk today about sort of my journey to become sort of a police reformer. I didn't start out that way. I started really in high school with an interest in human rights that that continued for me through college. And then when I was in law school, I continued to do some human rights work, but I really began to focus on human rights in the domestic context. And for me, human rights is really about making sure that the state respects people's rights and making sure that they treat everybody with fundamental dignity, regardless of who they are, what they might have done, or whether you agree with them. And for me, that was really something that I found really motivating to work on those issues. And in the United States, a lot of those issues come up in the context of prisons and jails, right? These are places where we do something that's pretty dramatic. We overlook how dramatic it is sometimes. We lock people up away from their families, and we do that for reasons that we hope are really good reasons, but you have to remember the importance of respecting the dignity of individuals, even if they've done things that we think are terrible. So I think that for me was a really important part of this. The very first case I did when I went to the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division was actually an investigation of the LA County jail system. And it was an investigation of how they treated persons who were in the jail who had serious mental illnesses. And for me, this was a really fundamental issue of human rights as well as constitutional rights. How really problematic, these really serious illnesses, and they were in jail. And one of the things I learned from that was that a lot of those people shouldn't be in jail. It was quite clear to me, right? This was not the best place for them. It was not the best place for us to be putting them. People were in jail not getting treatment and then getting out of jail worse than they were when they got in. And it just wasn't working for anyone. And so that made me want to think about, how did people get into jail? And so I began to think about policing and the laws that police enforce and how police enforce those laws. So it was really that investigation of the LA County jails and trying to contend with how we decided to put people in jails that made me want to go upstream a little bit and think about policing.
Wonderful. I am a LA resident myself, so that is nice to hear. Just going off of what you talked about, that you began investigating jails, prisons, and police departments, I'm curious, as right now we're in a time of change, what were the biggest challenges within the criminal justice system in the late 90s that you may have noticed? And would you say that the system faces similar or different issues today?
Yeah, it's really interesting. In some ways, it was very different. In other ways, it's sort of surprisingly the same. One of the big differences, it's analogous to today. Um, in the 1990s, we were in the midst of what is now called mass incarceration. We were putting a lot of people in prison for all sorts of things. And the work of the people like I was doing was work to sort of try to make those jails and prisons better. We weren't thinking about shrinking the size of prisons or jails. That was just not the path that anyone thought that we were on. We were just trying to make them constitutional so they didn't violate people's rights. And then slowly over time, we realized that that just wasn't going to work, that this wasn't helping. And that's when people actually started to think about, wait, why are these people in prisons and jails? Maybe we don't need to put so many people in prisons and jails. Up until the point where the last 5 years or so, a little bit longer now, we've actually seen a decrease in the number of people in prison in the United States, which is kind of a big deal given that we incarcerate more people in the United States per capita than any country on earth. And I see an analog to that in what we are thinking about today with policing. Right now, it is really seen as really a dramatic, radical thing to think about. Well, maybe do we need so much policing? Do we need so many police? Shouldn't we just make policing better? And that's where we were in the 90s with prisons and jails. And so for me, it's like, it may seem strange and scary and dramatic, but it's actually not a bad conversation to be having. So that's one way that it sort of was different, but I see echoes of that in what's going on today. And then other things I think that are, I think in a really positive way different today is that I think that today we have more of a recognition that a lot of the crime that we see and a lot of the problems that we see are caused by intergenerational trauma, are caused by the trauma caused by, that results from poverty and the lack of mental health care and the lack of medical care. And that wasn't really the conversation. That was seen as really excuse making in the 90s. It was the ethos was you need to punish people, you need to teach them that there are consequences for their actions. And there wasn't a sense that, well, maybe if we provide people more supports and more resources, they wouldn't be committing these crimes. We wouldn't be in this situation, not for everyone, of course, but at least there might be some other tools to decrease the number of people that we have to police and to put in jail and prison.
Wonderful. And I see we have some new audience members. I would just like to encourage everyone to submit any questions you have via the chat box at the bottom of your screen. As you see, we do have some prepared questions, so we would love to hear from you. Professor Lopez, I would love to talk a little bit more actually about the mental health aspect. It's interesting that you say, that was something you noticed in the 90s as well. There has been a call for maybe mental health professionals to ride along with police officers. When you call 911, maybe a family member or a friend is having a mental health episode, whatever that may look like, and it may come across as dangerous or aggressive, and they call 911 and police officers then, come to the scene. Do you think it's doable? That's something in the near future that we could maybe see other health professionals or, join police officers when addressing these calls?
Not only do I think it's doable, Maddie, I think it's already being done in a lot of places, and we really just need to see more of that. And I think it's important for people to think about mental health crises. It's sort of 3 stages. The first is the stage of prevention. If we invest in a mental health care system, we can prevent people from falling in crisis, right? And the beauty of that is not only that you don't need to call out police, you don't need to spend those resources, you don't need to risk that very dangerous situation, but if you keep people from falling into mental health crisis, then you just prevent so much angst and harm and sadness for those individuals who live with that mental illness and for their families, right? So that's really where we should really be focusing our energies. Let's just have a better mental health care system so that we don't have people falling into crisis in the first place. The second thing you need to do is you do need to build up some totally non-police responses to persons in mental health crisis. And in recent months, we've been seeing more emphasis on organizations like this, groups like this. There's the Cahoots group in Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, that's been operating for decades, similar groups across the country. And they actually they're not police, but when someone's in crisis, they are called and they can go and they can talk to the person. They're skilled, they're social workers, they're mental health workers. They can help people find housing for the night, or hook them up with rehab services, or hook them up with other social services. And so that's a really important place to be putting our resources as well, so that people don't need to be faced with this contact with law enforcement, which when you're in a mental health crisis can actually escalate the problems. But I do think we have to recognize that there will be some situations where you do want someone who's trained in sort of handling people who might be violent, who might have weapons, right? And those right now, we call them police, and that's great, but we need to train them better. Now, some of the models do have what you're talking about, what's called a co-responder model. So you might send out a police officer along with the mental health worker, right? And that's a really wonderful model that's used in a lot of places. Another is to have specially trained teams of police officers who are trained not only in in police officer tactics, but also in mental health, in mental health interactions, so they know how to respond in those situations. So I think if we think about it in those three buckets of things, a solid mental health system, a solid non-police response, and then better systems and training for when police do respond, then we're going to have a much better situation and avoid a lot of not only avoid a lot of the tragic incidents that make the news with alarming frequency, but also just improve the lives of people living with mental illness and their families.
Wow, yes, and I know defunding the police, one of the calls for that is to take that money and fund social services, as you were just mentioning. And talking more about that, you are currently a professor from practice at Georgetown Law, teaching courses on criminal justice and police criminal justice reform. You also co-lead Georgetown Law's program on innovative policing. Can you speak to the difference between abolishing the police and defunding the police? I know Kamala Harris uses the term reimagining the police, and what society would look like if either abolishing or defunding the police went into place.
Yeah, I think, I've heard, I like reimagining, I like rethinking the police quite a lot, because for me, it really does, it surfaces this issue that we really need to ask some very hard questions about policing, while acknowledging more explicitly, more clearly, that police have a role to play in public safety, just not as big of a role as we've currently given them. And I think it's in this conversation, again, when you think about how unthinkable it was back in the 90s to think about reducing the size of prisons and jails, and we just needed to make them better, it really is similar, and we should be thinking about that same idea here, that there are some things we can do to make policing better, but there really are some things that police are doing that maybe we don't need them to be doing. And I think that to answer that question, we first need to be clear that we haven't really been thinking about public safety in the way we should be thinking about public safety. Public safety is not just about street crime, right? Public safety is also about ending food insecurity. It's about ensuring adequate housing and education. It's about making sure that everybody has access to the medical and mental health care that they need, right? That's what people really need to be safe and to be healthy. And when we think about that way, we realize, oh, there's a whole lot of actors that need to be involved in public safety besides police and firefighters, which is right now what we generally tend to think of when we think of public safety. And what's beautiful about that is that if we were to provide public safety and think about public safety and meet those public safety needs more robustly, we would also reduce street crime, right? People will commit less crimes if they have better housing and better mental health care and all of those things. So it really does, it all dovetails together. And once we have that in our mind, then we can think more rationally about how we better match the tool to the problem, right? Currently, we have pretty much one tool, policing, and we apply it to everything. Loose dogs, a person who appears to be homeless, who's on a street corner, muttering to him or herself, right? That is something we need to attend to, but why police? I was talking with a retired chief yesterday who said her very first call as a police officer was 2 cats fighting in an apartment, right? Why would we send the police to that, right? And then there's things like armed robbery in progress, right? Maybe that is something you do want to send the police to, right? But of all the 4 things I just said, only one of those 4 was something that really requires a police response, but all 4 of them is something that currently we send police to. And if you actually look at the data, it's actually more like out of every 10 calls, probably only 1 of them do we need the police to be responding to. So I think that's what we need to be really mindful of, that when we think about reimagining police and rethinking police, we're really, part of what we're doing is rethinking public safety, and then just making sure that we have the right tools to meet people's public safety needs, and recognizing that that's not always the police. And police, by the way, themselves, of course, will tell you this. They know that they're doing too much, and they're doing more than things that are completely outside their skill set. And they would like other competent, either governmental or non-governmental organizations to respond as well.
Wonderful. We do have an audience question. They're asking if you have any recommendations for citizens and what they can do to help with justice reform.
That is such a great question. And there are so many things. I almost want to ask who you are and what you do now, because almost no matter who you are and what you're doing now, you can use those skills and that experience and an opportunity to work on justice reform. There's everything from just showing up not only when there's something that obviously pertains to criminal justice reform on the ballot. Maybe there's a progressive prosecutor who's running for office. Maybe they want to decriminalize some of the things that make it so easy to put homeless people in jail rather than giving them help, for example. But there's also just showing up when your city is considering the budget for your public safety department, right? There's understanding how much money are we putting into education in my county, in my state. All those sorts of, those sorts of things that we don't necessarily think about criminal justice reform, but as I was just saying, really feed into public safety, and we need to really be involved in those.
I completely agree. So shifting a little bit, you mentioned before your work at the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division, and I know you served as Deputy Chief in the Special Litigation Section from 2010 to just recently 2017. For some audience members who may not know, can you tell us a little bit about the Civil Rights Division at the DOJ? And if you could claim one thing to be your biggest accomplishment during your time there.
Oh, well, that's that assumes I accomplished anything, and I hope I did, but I'll tell you what I think it was, and you all can decide. But so the Civil Rights Division is just one division in the Department of Justice, right? Which the Department of Justice also has the criminal division, the antitrust division, and it's mostly about lawyers prosecuting people and law enforcement. So it's a little bit odd almost to have in this department a civil rights division, but I actually think it's really amazing, and one of the things that makes the U.S. so so inspiring in many ways, that we have a division at the highest level of government whose job it is to make sure that every individual's civil rights are respected. Now there's challenges, and especially over the past 4 years, I think we've all seen how there are limitations to what the Department of Justice can do, and it can very easily be politicized. I'm not pretending that it's this panacea and everything that flows from there is rainbows and unicorns. But I think that it is important to value the fact that we have a civil rights division, and to be motivated to protect it. The division itself has a number of different sections, and one of them is called the housing section, and they protect people's housing rights. The education section protects people's education rights. Disability, you get the idea, right? The section I worked in was called the special litigation section, so no one knew what we did. But one of the things that we did, in addition to trying to protect the rights of individuals who were institutionalized, not only in jails and prisons, but also in places like nursing homes. But we also were given authority to enforce a statute that said that that the Attorney General could investigate if there is a pattern or practice of law enforcement agencies violating individuals' rights. And if there was, if that investigation showed that there was a pattern or practice of violating people's rights, we had the authority to file suit. But normally what you don't want to do when you've just found that an entire police department is routinely violating people's rights is take them to court and fight with them in court for years and years and years to prove up all those cases, right? You want to get to the remedy as quickly as possible. And thankfully, usually the police department does as well. So what we would do instead of suing them usually is we would try to negotiate an agreement to fix the problems. And those agreements go by a number of names, but when they're filed in a court, and they have the ongoing oversight of a federal judge, we call them consent decrees. And that just means a negotiated agreement that everyone is trying to work together to fix. And you won't be surprised to hear that it can take years to fix a police department that's been systematically violating people's rights. So that's what the section did, and that's what I did for a number of years in places like LA, LAPD, both LAPD and LA County, in places like New Orleans, Louisiana, and Newark, in Chicago. Probably the case that I worked on that was the most famous was the Ferguson Police Department in Missouri. And I don't know if that's the one where I feel that it was my biggest accomplishment, but what I like about that case is that it came in a moment where we were able to recognize the importance of giving community members a voice, of trying to tell their stories through our findings report, and to try to let the world know that there was this thing happening in Ferguson that was having a dramatic effect on the lives of people there, and tell that story in such a way that people could look at their own communities and ask, wait, is that happening here? How are we, what kinds of racial disparities do we have here? What sorts of tensions do we have here? How are we using our fines and our fees to protect public safety, or are we using them to raise revenue? All those conversations happened across the country, in part because we were able to tell the story of Ferguson in a very sort of prominent way because it was the Department of Justice. So I think that I find satisfying that I was able to be part of that to help tell that story that had such an impact on communities all across the country.
It's so impressive and inspiring that, you've dedicated your career and your life to this. And I hope, I know in recent times, hopefully there's just a lot of self-reflection of, what's going on in the environment around me, even if it's not personally affecting me or any of my loved ones. We do have more audience questions. So someone is asking, in your opinion, what role should police play, if any, on a university campus? Should they have a presence?
That is a really great question, and one that I have been talking about with my own university, Georgetown University, and our law school campus. So, and let me just say one thing at the outset, which is that I think policing should be very local, and by that what I mean is it has to be really tailored to the needs of a particular community, right? So it's very hard for me to say, what should policing look like on a university, because it might need to look very differently in one university than another. But I will say one thing, and this might sound like really crazy to some people, or you might be like, oh yeah, we do that. I get both responses. So I actually think that we don't need campus police to be armed. And it's interesting, right? So in Washington, D.C., the law school is in the center of Washington, D.C., in the middle of a place where you do get, street crime, and our law enforcement, our campus police officers are not armed. And that's hasn't been a problem. And if you look at campuses across the country, it's not a problem when you don't arm your campus police, right? And I think there's a lot of really powerful reasons not to arm police. I mean, I think it shows that policing can help preserve order without that threat of a weapon and without the potential danger of a weapon. I'm sure most of you may know that somewhere in the high 90s of police officers will never fire their weapon throughout the course of their career. It's not, a weapon is not the integral part of policing that we think it is. And I know would be a very hard thing to say sort of in policing generally, but certainly on campuses, I think we can begin to have that conversation more broadly about whether police should even be armed. And I also think that we should really be thinking, we really need to make sure our campus police in particular are really attuned to the dangers, not only of racial profiling and implicit bias, but of things like stereotyped threat. And what I mean by that is when a lot of the things that legally count as suspicious activity that give police officers the authority to stop you or search you are the very same things that people do when they're nervous because they see a police officer. And there's something called stereotype threat, which means that if you believe that someone is stereotyping you, and you know that, like, oh, they think that, if you're African American and you say, oh, I know, I'm worried that officer might think that I don't belong here because I'm Black, right? You might start to act consistently with that stereotype, right? You might start to act really nervous, like you don't belong there, right? And if the officer's not trained to recognize that this is what's happening, then you might get an officer who just through the law, like following the law, says, well, this person was checked all the boxes for behaving suspiciously. So we need to look at, and stops the person. And what you get on campus after campus is people of color being stopped more frequently. And they're, even though they've done nothing wrong. This is a problem that happens everywhere. And part of the problem, part of the reason for that is that we make it too easy to stop people under the law. And part of the reason is that we haven't really trained officers that some people are acting suspiciously because they're nervous around you. And you need to be really mindful of that and figure out other ways of determining who's really suspicious, who's really up to no good.
Before moving on to the next audience question, I'd love to follow up on officer training. I know there's been a lot of criticism of it in the past 6 months, and to be honest, I don't know that much about it. Would you say it's rigorous enough? Would you say that needs to be something that's looked at? Do they need more of it? I've heard calls for, specific education, maybe have a background or a degree in criminal justice or who knows? What are your thoughts and what has research shown on that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about training, and most of it is just really wrong. I could really go on for a long time about police training. First of all, in addition to training for officers, we really need education for officers. And by that, I mean, when I think of training, I think of skills that officers need to know, perhaps defensive tactics, things like that. But they need education about what it means to be a police officer. They need to be educated about the communities that they're working in, so that they understand those communities. They need to, gentrification is a big issue in Washington, D.C., and I know in the Riverside area as well. And when you don't understand that generations of people have been living here and that the new norms that are coming in are just at odds with that, you police in a very different way, and it can cause problems. One of the things in terms of sort of the training that people get to become police officers, or the criteria for becoming police officers, we've tended to think that police officers should all have criminal justice backgrounds and should be trained in those things. But actually, we probably need police who are, math majors and culinary, degrees. We need a diversity of perspectives and a group of people who just don't all look at the world through that lens of criminal justice. And that's actually what we're seeing creates a better, more diverse and inclusive and just creative police force. Because what you really want to train your officers to do is to be able to exercise judgment well. And that involves really honing their critical thinking skills. Because no matter how many rules you create for police officers, every day they're going to encounter situations that they never expected. And they're going to need to be able to think through those issues. The other thing, so I'm involved in 2 programs at Georgetown. One of them is called the Police for Tomorrow program, where we take brand new officers who are still in the police academy, some of them, or they're just out, and we actually try to educate them. We educate them about youth brain development, the fact that kids' brains, they're not acting that way because it's personal against you or they hate you. They're acting that way because their brain is literally reforming its synapses and is not going to be fully put back together but they're in their mid-20s. So if they're acting a little, like, don't worry about it. They're going to get better. It's not about you, but they're just behaving like kids, right? And that's what kids do. And so when they understand that, officers tend not to take that so personally, and they don't get so riled up when kids are being obnoxious, because guess what? Teenagers are obnoxious. So that's part of it, just sort of teaching them about that. We teach them about, we do teach them about implicit bias and the impact that can have on them, and stereotype threat. We talk to them about the local community in DC. We talk to them about the history of race in policing, all sorts of things that frankly they don't get in the academy, but they should. the kind of training they get instead is too often too focused on all the things that can kill you as a police officer. Officers need to be trained in those dangers, but if you go overboard in that area, you can make them hypersensitive, and pretty soon they think everybody's out to get them. And that's where you get some of this, this sort of tendency to be too quick to respond. So that's part of what needs, and I'm oversimplifying a lot here, but just in the interest of time. But so we need to sort of shift some of the training to be less about all the things that should terrify you as an officer to more about the community that you're serving and ways to be a better critical thinker in responding to that. The other big thing I want to talk about in terms of training is what we call active bystandership. I think anyone who saw the video of George Floyd being killed not only was troubled by Officer Derek Chauvin, who had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for almost 8 minutes, but by the 3 officers who stood by doing nothing, right? And that's something that unfortunately I have seen for years, for decades now, in reading use of force reports and watching cell phone footage and watching body cam footage. You often see officers who don't step in to prevent really egregious harm. And we would think that, well, you shouldn't need to train anybody to do that. They'll just do that. But what we know from social science is that people don't intervene even when they should, right? We know, for example, that we've learned from the airline industry that there will be a co-pilot, right? There was a famous incident of a co-pilot who let the pilot fly the airplane into the side of the mountain, saying, Captain, should we be doing this? But never intervening, never taking control of the airplane, even though it was clearly would have been in their best interest to do that, right? We have the same, it's the same idea that's in Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? You're not going to try to get the person who's drunk not to drive. You get the friends of the person who's drunk not to let that person do that stupid thing, right? We've got it through the Green Dot program on college campuses, right? So that people know to intervene when you have someone who is intoxicated and wants to go off with somebody else into a corner, right? Who's even more intoxicated, right? Teach friends how to intervene. We've done that in the hospital setting, right? Teaching nurses how to speak up, even though the doctor who has hierarchy, always thinks they're right. They're about to operate on the wrong person. You need to step in. That's not as easy as it sounds. We all think we would, and some of us would, but most of us don't. And we can all remember the time when we intervened and did something brave, but we forget about the times where we just stood by and didn't say anything, right? Well, police officers are no different. And in many respects, a lot of what we call inhibitors to intervention are even more powerful. It's not just the hierarchy, but it's a lot about that group cohesion, right, that we all feel. And with policing, that's really strong. And it's really hard for police to go against their fellow officers and tell them to stand down or to step back or do something different. And so in 2012, as part of a consent decree, actually, the New Orleans Police Department started training officers in what they were calling peer intervention. They developed a program called Ethical Policing is Courageous. And they actually started training officers, like the words to use. They taught them to recognize the inhibitors to intervention and how to overcome those. And we saw a big difference in New Orleans. We saw officers stepping in and preventing misconduct where they previously wouldn't have. But we couldn't get anybody else. We couldn't get very many police departments to understand the importance of that training. They all said, we already do that training. And communities said, you shouldn't need to train people in that. Well, that all changed when people saw that video of George Floyd being killed, right? People saw, we need to do this. We've got to try harder. So we launched this program through Georgetown called the Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement program. And we're now actually training officers on how you intervene and how, and this is important, how you create a culture back in your department that supports intervention, that doesn't retaliate against officers who do that, that rewards them for doing that. So I think that's another, and the thing about that training that's so important is it helps redefine courage for officers. We all think of physical courage. That's something we train a lot on, but we don't train officers how to be morally courageous, right? And moral courage is something that you use almost every day as a police officer, and it's often much more difficult than physical courage. So it's training for that. And it's also training in education to help redefine loyalty so that you recognize that loyalty isn't always about letting your fellow officer do whatever he or she wants. Sometimes it's about stepping in to keep that person from doing whatever he or she wants. So I think, that's where training needs to go, towards those sorts of things that are really about helping officers have the tools to exercise their discretion in a way that is more empathetic, that displays moral courage, that is more judicious, and really understand and reflects an understanding of the communities they serve.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that, almost that sense of brotherhood, that you don't want to turn on your brother, but that's not what you're
Right.
doing, you know?
Yeah.
So I love that ethical policing. I hope more and more departments begin to implement that. We do have another audience question. They ask, how would you envision parsing out which type of professional would respond to which situation, going back to talking about, the mental health aspect and the various calls police officers respond to?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And again, I think the answer to that question might be different in different communities, but we are already doing some of this. And part of it goes back to our whole 911 system, right? So we have this 911 system that could have been a system that you call and you get, there's 15, 20 different options. But right now it's pretty much police or fire when you call 911. So right now, some cities are now embedding mental health or medical professionals into the 911 call center so that you can they're in a better position to figure out, wait, does this really need a police officer? Or maybe we just need to send an ambulance. Or maybe if I just talk to this person, we won't need to send anybody at all, right? So that's going to be different in every community, and you're going to need some system at the front end of it to help you decide who to send. But a lot of it is also going to need, and this is where the controversy about defund comes in, right? Because a lot of it's going to be about putting resources in these other response systems, right? Maybe we do need, people always say, well, no social worker is going to come into your house at 2:00 in the morning. Well, maybe we need to fund social workers 24/7, right? So when that homeless person is muttering to themselves on that corner at 2 in the morning, there's someone there besides a cop that you can send out and help get that person into a bed, right? Maybe we need to invest more in housing and in rehabilitation so that we don't have those sorts of situations from happening. So it's complicated. It's not something that's going to happen over the next 2 years, but it's the kind of thing that we can begin to build those additional resources, and we can begin to build those systems that allow us to better identify who to send for any particular situation. And again, in places like in places across the country, they've already started to do some of that work, and so they have people who can go out and figure out what that individual's needs are and connect them with what they need.
On a smaller level, in high school, I worked at my local library, and we would have many homeless patrons
Yep.
who would kind of stay all day, and we let them do their thing, unless they got irritated or something like that. And when they did, we actually had I believe she was either a social worker or a therapist on call. So that we didn't have to turn to the security guard first, but that, we could kind of bring her in to talk to them. And we saw really great success with her creating relationships and understanding, maybe why they're behaving the way they are, and helping them through that. So just on a really small but personal level, I have kind of seen that.
No, I don't think that's small at all, Maddie. I think that's really important, and I think we need to be thinking more about those sorts of micro solutions, because that's really what I mean when I say local. This doesn't need to be a big federal program coming down from. This is giving each community the resources and the support and the latitude they need to figure out what do we need to meet the needs of people in our community. And it's going to be different everywhere, and it's exactly those sorts of things. It seems simple and small, but it's so dramatic that the difference that you make every time you send in a social worker instead of a police officer into a situation like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I greatly appreciate it, and yeah, again, I hope on more local levels we see this happen. I would love to talk more about George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. So, as we all know, the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others have revived the Black Lives Matter movement, back in May and June, and led people to flood the streets calling for justice. What do you believe it will take to see real change on the national level? I know we've been talking more local and maybe even state by state, but on the national level in regards to police brutality.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I will say that after after Ferguson, when we released the Ferguson Report, and it got quite a lot of attention, and people seemed to be recognizing that, this city seemed to be doing all these things for reasons that were racially motivated, not public safety motivated, and they really were causing a lot of harm and really treating people of color differently. I was like, oh, good, people get it. This is great. And then it kind of, honestly, it made some difference, but mostly on the fines and fees part of thing. It really didn't cause people to understand the role that race plays and how much that drives how policing has always happened in this country. And I was really sort of disappointed and a bit disillusioned and think, I get, we don't really, what's it going to take to get the United States to understand what a fundamental issue this is. And then after George Floyd, I think, the protests after George Floyd were the largest protests this nation's ever seen. There was one day, I believe it was June 7th, perhaps, there were what was it? I want to say 500,000 people were protesting in different cities, maybe more, but it was this unprecedented number, right? People all over, we saw tiny towns with protests, we saw huge cities with protests. People really woke up to this issue in a way that seemed to me to build on the work that had been done in Ferguson, but that had sort of been latent, right, for a while. It hadn't really emerged. And I realized that's kind of how this work happens, that we plant those seeds and we hope some of them come up right away and others it takes a while. And so I think that's part of the answer to how change is going to happen on the national level. It's going to happen more slowly than we'd like and intermittently. It's where you least expect it, you're going to see a big change. And so I think that's part of the answer. I think that one of the most dramatic changes in recent months has been the responsiveness of state and local governments to the concerns of people about these issues. And that, I think, provides an opening for legislative processes to change policing in a way that wasn't there before. And we're seeing that to a large extent. We saw in the last election, we saw a number of initiatives pass at the state and local level. And, on everything from decriminalizing certain things to changing the standards for when deadly force is allowed, to banning certain police practices. And so I think that is going to become a more prominent feature in how we change policing, because there's more of an understanding that you have a majority of people in more places who can convince the legislators, and legislatures are a majoritarian sort of feature of our government. I do think it's important to keep in mind that in some of the places where change is needed most, those might be the same places where you continue not to have majority support, right? And for me as a civil rights advocate, it has always been clear that one of the roles of civil rights and civil rights advocates is to advocate for people who may not be in the political majority, right? Who may be what we call a discrete and insular minority, who are not going to have their rights protected by the majority because the majority not only is different from them, but doesn't understand or maybe even doesn't care about their needs. So I do think that even as we recognize that there's more opening at the legislative level for majoritarian processes to address these issues, we have to continue to fight for people in places where the majority is still dismissive of those concerns, of those needs. A lot of that fighting will be done through the courts. Some of it will be done through, sort of protest, but we can't forget that aspect of it as well, I think.
Yes, and I feel like it's difficult these days with media. You hear a plethora of things and it's kind of like, I don't know what's right. I've heard things about independent investigations of police departments and sheriff's departments. Does that not happen already? Does it? Do you have any insights on, right, in the situation of George Floyd, when the DA or, calls for that, their persecution, like how does that all go down?
Yeah, so there's two, it's a really good question. And there's two important things to remember and to think about. One is that in an incident like George Floyd, or many of these incidents, there's the individual officers to contend with, and then there's the systems that allowed those officers to become officers, stay officers, do what they were doing without any penalties prior to the dramatic incident, right? So for the individual officers, there's a couple of different things you can do. You can investigate them through the normal, what we call administrative processes that any employee, right? You can investigate any employee for misconduct and fire them, right? Because they violated policy. That's one thing you can do with officers, right? And police departments can and do that, although honestly not enough. There's a tendency to let officers continue on with their jobs even when they violated policy in really terrible ways. The other thing, of course, that you can do is you can file a civil lawsuit. You can sue the officer in court for money damages. This is the way of holding individual officers accountable that is impacted by what people are talking about when we talk about qualified immunity. And what the courts have made it very difficult to sue officers for money damages when they violate people's rights. You basically have to have been completely incompetent as a police officer. So that's why people are really advocating for change of qualified immunity rules. And then, of course, you can prosecute officers and try to send them to jail, which in some respects some ways may be exactly the right thing to do. Although from the abolitionist perspective, they will tell you that no one should be prosecuted, not even police officers. But it may be the right thing to do, but you have to recognize that if you only do that, if you only prosecute individual officers, you're probably never going to fix the underlying systems that allowed those officers to flourish. And so you really do have to do that broader investigation and action against the department. And that can be done. That's what we did at the Department of Justice with their pattern or practice investigations, but it doesn't have to be. And I think it's important to recognize that state and local governments can and should be conducting those independent investigations of their police departments when necessary, because there's only one civil rights division and we have like 30 attorneys that work there doing this work, and there's 18,000 police departments. So there's, it's not going to be the complete answer to that issue. So one of the things that I've been really advocating for over the past several years is that states develop their own authority and exercise that authority to hold the police departments and their agencies accountable, and that local governments do the same, and beef up that outside oversight so that they know what their police departments are doing, and hopefully they can nip problems in the bud before they take over a whole department.
Yes. Yeah, that like it's necessary. We have another audience question shifting back to criminal justice reform, actually. And they ask if you have any thoughts on programs we could put into place that could help previously incarcerated people, currently incarcerated, any reform in that sense.
That is such a great question. And there are a number of initiatives along those lines of helping what we often call re-entering citizens, right? It's so hard for people coming back from prison or jail to remake their lives. And remember, remember the brain development stuff I was talking about earlier, a lot of people get put in prison or jail when they were young and behaving like their brain was falling apart, because it was. And now when they're older, they're completely different people, right? And they're capable of completely different things, but they are burdened with this stigma of prison and jail. And all they need is a chance so many times. I mean, that's not always true, of course, but it is overwhelmingly the case that all those individuals need is a chance. One of the things that people have done is sort of advocate for what they call block the box, which is not having the box that requires that you say whether you were previously incarcerated for some jobs. Unfortunately, what we found happened with that is that it was good for white people who had been in prison, but not for Black people, because if there was no box, unfortunately, some employers would assume that the Black applicant had been incarcerated and the white applicant had not been, even if it was the opposite. So this is, again, one of this really pernicious impacts of race in our country that prevents so many things that should work well from working well. So what we've tried to do instead, what people are working on instead, is a couple things. One is reducing the institutional sort of barriers to getting a job after you've been in prison or jail. So for example, in many states, if you had a prison record, you weren't allowed to get a license as a hairdresser or a barber, right? That doesn't make any sense. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these sorts of restrictions that prevent you from getting a job that really has nothing to do with whether you were in prison or jail, right? And so people have been working on trying to remove those systematically from state governments and from state and federal law. And the other thing is just having specific programs for people who are reentering. So you actually you actually say, we want to hire people who are coming here from prison or jail, and we want to help support you because we know it's hard. We want to help you get an ID. We want to help you get an apartment, and we're going to set you up for success. So those sorts of things can be really important. But I have to say that's sort of what I meant when I said at the outset that no matter who you are, you can be helpful in this area, because part of it is just giving someone a chance, right? And we're often in a position, and maybe we're interviewing someone for a job, or we're letting our colleagues know what we think about someone who's on probation at a job, and to just give them a chance, and recognize that people who have been in prison and jail are no different than you or I. They really aren't, and they can do this work, any work, and they'll be grateful for it. And it's better for all of us if we incorporate people back into society after they've been in prison or jail.
Definitely. And I know you were mentioning mass incarceration at the very beginning of this seminar, and I know the war on crime, the war on drugs, are two big reasons why numbers really went up. I'm curious, I know, state by state, there is the legalization of marijuana or the decriminalization of marijuana, but do you see any more big change to make it maybe so there is no more mass incarceration where, crime is redefined or drugs are redefined?
Yeah. So I think so there was not long, but for a while when we started thinking about mass incarceration and the causes of it, we start talking about a lot of the low-level drug crimes that result in people going to prison. And that is true. There are, and there's still terrible stories of people who are in prison for 30, 40 years for a really small amount of marijuana. Like that's a thing that has happened, and we need to attend to that. And that continues to this day, but has been very much addressed to some extent because of the opioid crisis. And the opioid crisis brought the reality of drug addiction and the harms of drugs to a much broader swath of America. And they began to see that this is a problem that is probably better addressed through treatment than through prison or jail. And so that we do seem to be making progress on that. It's unclear like how far along we'll go down that road or how quickly we will. But the other issue, of course, is that what we began to realize when we looked very closely at those numbers is it didn't really explain all mass incarceration entirely, the drug violations. There are a lot of people in jail for violent crimes, right? And so we do have to really, you can't ignore that. You can't pretend that that it's not a problem. People in communities where there's a lot of violent crime deserve to be protected and deserve you to be working on reducing crime, not just saying well, sorry, we don't want to put them in prison, so they're coming back, right? So the idea is not that you just pretend that this isn't happening. The idea is to find ways that are more effective at preventing and addressing violent crime that don't cause the same really dramatic harm of ripping up communities and ripping up families by sending people away to prison for 10, 20, 30 years. And so there are a number of different, everything from what they call violence interrupters, where they actually have programs that can try to identify, who get to know community members and identify when sort of beefs are happening and when violence might be on the horizon, and try to intercede in that and prevent that from happening, and figure out what people need to not resort to violence, and try to meet those needs in other ways. And there are mediation services, restorative justice services, mental health services that we know can help people recover from being the victims of violence, or from, as I was talking about earlier, some of the trauma and the harms of just living in poverty. And if we do those things, there's actually growing research that shows that we can reduce violence in communities without ever resorting to prison or jail, and actually avoiding the violent crime in the first place. So it really is just about thinking more creatively and more empathetically about how we prevent violence, and then putting our resources in those, trusting that we can put our resources into those services and actually prevent violence, and then we don't have to send people to prison or jail. But it requires you to look at the causes of violence and address those at their roots. You can't just say we're just not going to send people to prison or jail for as long because we don't want mass incarceration. You really have to look at what is causing violence in our communities.
Yes, yeah, the root causes and the symptoms. We are so close out of time, but I would love to ask just one more brief question on private prisons and maybe their role in criminal justice reform. I know that is a controversial topic as well, and we have limited time, but just any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's hard for me because I've spent a lot of time in prisons and jails across this country, and some of the best ones and the worst ones were private prisons. So I have to say that in theory, I'm opposed to them because it just seems like we don't want to live in a country where people are profiting after off of the imprisonment of other people, right? That should be something we do begrudgingly because we have to, not because we're making money off of it. There are, Sean Hopwood, who's a professor at Georgetown Law, it was also, he robbed a couple banks when he was young and spent 8 years in prison. And he will tell you, and he's now a prison reformer, and he will tell you, so this is with, I'm mentioning that because it's someone with experience, that the private prisons were just much more humane in many respects. And I've seen that. So it's a very difficult issue because, as I say, in theory, I think it's fundamentally corrosive to have a system of private prisons. But in the immediate term, they may well be causing less harm to people. So I think we need to sort of, again, figure out why that is, what the obstacles are to having less harm in non-private prisons, and not just sort of take this sort of like good or bad approach. We have to really interrogate that further before we know what the best thing to do is, in my view.
I did not know that. I've always, my perception of private prisons were very negative. So to hear that actually someone's experience was that it was more humane than.
Right? I know, it's strange. I mean, like, as I said, they can be very bad as well. It's just not as monolithic as you might think. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That is crazy. That's why we're here, to learn about stuff.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, we are drawing a close, so I just want to say on behalf of the University of California, Riverside Alumni Association, thank you to our audience for joining us today for our virtual homecoming event. We appreciate you taking the time to be part of today's event and hope you've gained valuable insight. I know I definitely have. I'd like to thank Christy for her time, generosity, and commitment to UCR and the Alumni Association. The insights and advice you shared today made me just really proud, to soon be a UCR alumni.
It should be. Yeah.
Yes, I am, and I hope any of our students in the audience feel the same way. To our audience, you will receive a follow-up email containing a recording of this webinar if you would like to share it or rewatch certain parts. We hope to see you during the rest of this week's homecoming events, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Professor Lopez, and happy homecoming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, UC Riverside.
Thank you.